cold fluorescent lights of the hospital cast harsh shadows on Rosalind Smith's pale face as she stared at the mounting bills in her trembling hands. $350,000. The numbers blurred before her eyes, each digit pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. At 24, Rosalind had imagined a different life, one filled with hope and opportunity, not drowning in debt and despair. She clutched the paper tighter, lifting her gaze to the stark white hospital bed where her father, David Smith, lay motionless. Once a strong and capable construction contractor, he was now a mere shadow of himself. Stage 4 lung cancer had drained the life from his body, turning every breath into a painful battle. "You should go home, sweetheart," his voice rasped, barely more than a whisper. Rosalind swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Dad," she lied. But the truth was, she was anything but fine. If she didn't find $350,000 for the experimental treatment, her father wouldn't survive. And she was running out of time. Rosalind sat motionless on her small bed, legs crossed, her old laptop barely balanced on her knees. The room was dark, the only illumination coming from the flickering glow of the screen, casting shadows across her tired face. A cheap glass of wine sat beside her, not for pleasure, but for dulling the storm of emotions raging inside her. She had tried everything. Bank loans? Denied. No collateral, no stable income, nothing that made her a worthy risk. Selling her old car? Not nearly enough. She had even reached out to charities, but the waiting lists were impossibly long, and her father didn't have time to wait. She closed her eyes, and immediately her father's frail figure on the hospital bed filled her mind. He had once been a strong man, always carrying himself with confidence, his hands rough from years of labor. Now his body was gaunt, his fingers trembling, his skin ashen, as if life itself was slipping away with every shallow breath. She remembered how he had gripped her hand before she left the hospital tonight, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Don't worry about me, Rosalind." But how could she not worry? How could she just stand by and watch as the disease slowly consumed him, simply because she didn't have enough money to save him? Her gaze drifted toward a bookmarked tab on her screen, one she had been avoiding for weeks, a website she had found in her most desperate nights, one that connected wealthy benefactors with young women in financial distress. Exclusive arrangements, connecting those who seek with those who can provide. It was sleek, polished, nothing like the seedy escort sites she had hastily closed before, but she knew what it really was: a transaction, an exchange. She scrolled through the profiles, beautiful women, elegantly dressed, showcasing their dreams and academic aspirations, yet delicately hinting at something unspoken. Everything was wrapped in sophistication, but the truth remained the same. She had hesitated for days. Every time her cursor hovered over the register button, doubt gnawed at her. But then the image of her father surfaced in her mind, his frail fingers clutching hers, his voice hoarse with exhaustion as he told her not to worry. But how could she not? How could she sit back and watch him fade away simply because she lacked the means to save him? A single tear slipped down her cheek as she exhaled shakily. Then, with trembling fingers, she clicked register. Within minutes, the bidding began. $100,000, then $200,000, then $500,000. Her pulse hammered in her ears, not from excitement, but from fear. $750,000. She felt sick. A part of her wanted to shut the laptop, pretend this had never happened, but she couldn't. This was her father's only chance. Then a name appeared, JB $1 million. No messages, no negotiations. Just one final, inescapable offer. The screen flashed, auction closed. The email arrived seconds later. Transaction complete. Location, the Four Seasons Hotel, New York, Suite 1506, Friday, 8 p.m. A car will pick you up. She stared at the words. She had sold herself. But could she actually go through with it? The black Lincoln Navigator glided smoothly through the rain-slicked streets of New York, its tires rolling silently over the glistening pavement. Rosalind sat stiffly in the back seat, her fingers clenched around her small clutch, her palms ice cold despite the warmth of the car's interior. Raindrops trailed down the tinted windows, distorting the neon city lights into streaks of color. She knew that with every passing second, she was getting closer to a moment she could never undo. "Would you like some music?" The driver's voice, Daniel, a professional-looking man in his 40s, broke the silence. Rosalind only shook her head. 15 minutes later, the car pulled up in front of the Four Seasons Hotel. The door opened, and a large black umbrella shielded her from the cold drizzle. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, elegantly dressed guests moving about their lives. No one knew why she was here. A woman stood waiting near the reception desk. "Miss Smith?" Rosalind nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm Regina Carter, Mr. Brown's personal assistant. Please follow me." Not meeting him directly, he hadn't even come to greet her himself. She followed Regina into the elevator. The higher they rose, the tighter her chest became. At the 15th floor, a plush carpeted hallway led to the heavy wooden door of Suite 1506. Regina knocked once, then stepped aside. "Mr. Brown is waiting inside." Rosalind stepped in. The suite was luxurious but not ostentatious. Soft lighting, deep mahogany furniture, a table set with a bottle of wine and 2 crystal glasses. But none of that mattered, because standing by the window was John Brown. Tall, mid-30s. His charcoal gray suit was tailored to perfection, his tie slightly loosened as if he had just come from a long day of work. His eyes, sharp, assessing, rested on her with quiet intensity. He turned, holding her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Rosalind Smith," he said, his voice smooth, measured. She swallowed, her throat dry. He didn't move toward her. Didn't reach for her. There was no urgency, no crude hunger in his demeanor. Instead, he walked to the table, picked up a folder, and slid it across to her along with a pen. "Our agreement," he said. "I want you to read it before we make any decisions." Rosalind looked down at the papers. The amount, $1 million, would be transferred to her account immediately, but one clause stood out. "You may leave at any time before physical intimacy occurs. The full amount must be returned within 24 hours. She looked up, confused. This wasn't what she had expected. He studied her expression, his gaze unreadable. "I'm not interested in unwilling partners," he said simply. Rosalind lifted the pen, then hesitated. Part of her wanted to ask, why, but another part of her wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed the pen to paper. John Brown remained exactly where he was, silent, composed, waiting for her choice. Rosalind wasn't sure what she had expected. Awkward silence, a suffocating tension, or perhaps the kind of possessive hunger that would remind her exactly why she was here. But tonight was nothing like what she had imagined. After signing the contract, she thought it would happen immediately, that John would take her into the bedroom, claim what he had paid an extravagant price for. But he didn't. Instead, he simply poured himself another drink and gestured toward the dining table near the window. "Would you like to have dinner?" Rosalind blinked. "Dinner?" A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "I believe our arrangement does not include letting you starve." She hesitated, then nodded. She wasn't particularly hungry, but sitting across from him at the table seemed far preferable to sitting alone with the storm of thoughts in her mind. The meal was unlike anything she had ever had before. Perfectly seared Wagyu steak, fresh greens, delicate sauces. But Rosalind quickly realized she couldn't taste a thing. John ate with the same deliberate control he carried in everything he did. Unhurried, composed, as if this were nothing more than an ordinary evening. There was no tension, no expectation lurking in his gaze. Midway through the meal, he finally spoke. "Why wait until now?" Rosalind's fingers tightened around her fork. "What do you mean?" John leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "You're not like the others on that site, not the type to set a price and seek out men with money. So why this?" Something twisted inside her chest. A part of her wanted to deflect, but when she looked into his eyes, sharp, assessing, yet absent of judgment. She realized he genuinely wanted to know. She set her fork down and took a steady breath. "My father has lung cancer," she said quietly but firmly. "He worked his whole life, but in the end, the illness took everything. I tried everything, loans, selling what I could, but it wasn't enough." John didn't interrupt. He simply listened. "This isn't something I ever wanted to do," she admitted, staring at the untouched water glass in front of her. "But when you love someone, sometimes you'll trade anything for them." A silence stretched between them. Then, John set his glass down with deliberate care. "I understand." 2 simple words. Yet they carried a weight she hadn't expected. Rosalind looked at him, and for the first time she felt something other than fear. She didn't know his past, but there was something in his voice, something unspoken, that told her he had lost something important too. For the first time tonight, she didn't feel like a commodity. A soft breeze slipped through the open window, causing the candlelight to flicker. Rosalind absent-mindedly lifted her hand to brush away a stray strand of hair, but before she could, warm fingers reached out first. John tucked the strand of hair behind her ear. A brief touch. Gentle, unrushed. But in that moment, Rosalind knew one thing for certain. She didn't want to leave. Rosalind didn't leave that night. Something had changed. After dinner, they kept talking, not about the contract, not about what they had agreed upon, but about real things. Loss, regret, the parts of themselves they had never shared with anyone else. As the night stretched on, John never pressured her. He simply said, "You can stay if you want to." And she did. But when she woke up the next morning in soft, expensive sheets, sunlight spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, John was already gone. All that remained was a neatly folded note beside the bed. "Breakfast is ready. If you need anything, ask Regina. And if you want to see me again, just say the word." She thought that was the end of it, that she would return to her life and John Brown would remain nothing more than a stranger she had met for one night. But he didn't disappear. He kept in touch. At first, just messages. "How's your father? Have you eaten?" Then calls. Then, one night, he appeared outside the coffee shop where she worked, claiming he needed a real cup of coffee because the one at his office was terrible. But Rosalie knew that was just an excuse. John hadn't let go of her. He was there, in the background, helping without pushing. When she struggled to cover her father's hospital fees, a mysterious, anonymous donor suddenly covered all expenses. She called him immediately. "It was you, wasn't it? Don't think of it as a debt." His voice was calm. "Think of it as an investment." An investment in what, she had wanted to ask, but she already knew the answer. Not in the hospital, not in a transaction, in her. And then, inevitably, they fell in love. But not everyone was happy about it. Vanessa Monroe, John's ex-fiancée and a major shareholder in his company, wasn't pleased when she learned about them. To her, John had belonged to her once, and if she couldn't have him, no one could. So she struck back. 2 weeks later, an article exploded across tabloids. The dark secret behind CEO John Brown. A high-class escort? Rosalind stared at the screen, feeling the ground disappear beneath her feet. She had never called herself that, never thought of herself that way, but the words in print had done it for her. And worse, Vanessa knew about her father. She hadn't just spread rumors. She had threatened to tell Rosalind's father the truth. Fear gripped her chest. If her father knew where the money had come from, how would he look at her? Rosalind made her decision. She called John, her voice shaking. "We can't do this." His voice sharpened. "What are you saying?" She inhaled, steadying herself. "This is too messy, too dangerous. You have your reputation. You have an entire company to protect. And you what?" he interrupted. "I can't let you lose everything because of me." Silence. Then his voice, low and firm. "If you think I'm going to let you face this alone, then you don't know me at all, Rosalind." And in that moment, she knew John Brown wasn't going to let her go. Camera flashes erupted. the sharp clicks of shutters echoing through the packed conference hall. Over 100 reporters had gathered, waiting for John Brown's downfall. But John wasn't afraid. Standing tall, his piercing gaze swept across the sea of journalists. There was no hesitation in his stance, no trace of fear. Beside him, Rosalind took a deep breath. Her hands trembled slightly, but she refused to back down. Today, she would not run. John adjusted the microphone, his voice steady and commanding. "We all know why we're here," he began, his tone filled with barely restrained fury. "Someone has tried to destroy Rosalind Smith's reputation with lies, but today I'm here to tell you the truth." The screen behind him lit up. A series of leaked emails appeared, exposing Vanessa Monroe, the major shareholder in his company, as the mastermind behind everything. Not only had she spread the rumors, but she had also manipulated stock prices, orchestrated scandals, and weaponized the media to ruin Rosalind. Murmurs rippled through the room. Reporters exchanged hurried whispers, pens flying across notepads. Hands shot up, but John refused to let them interrupt. He turned to the cameras. His next words would change everything. "Yes, I met Rosalind through an unconventional arrangement." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Yes, money changed hands. And yes, that transaction was supposed to be the end of our interaction." Then he turned to Rosalind, his voice softened. But instead, it was just the beginning. Silence. Then, the sound of cameras clicking, a frenzied rush as the story shifted before their very eyes. People had painted Rosalind as a gold digger, but now they saw her differently. She stepped forward, her eyes fierce with determination. This was her moment. She took the microphone, breathing deeply before she spoke. "There's something I need to say." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. The room fell silent. "Yes, I sold my virginity." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, the furious scribbling of pens against notepads. Rosalind could feel the weight of their judgment pressing in, but she didn't flinch. She lifted her chin, her voice unwavering. "I am not a fraud. I did not do this for luxury, nor for selfish gain. I did it because I was desperate, because my father, the only family I have left, was dying, and I had no other way to save him." She exhaled shakily, scanning the sea of faces before her, some skeptical, some curious, and some, for the first time, filled with understanding. "I made a choice," she continued, her voice stronger now, "and I will never apologize for choosing to fight for the person who gave me life. But what I will never sell is my dignity." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with raw, unfiltered truth. "My father has cancer. I worked 2 jobs, applied for loans, begged charities for help, but time was running out and I was left with no other choice." She paused, steadied herself, then lifted her chin. "I made a desperate decision, but I never sold my dignity." This time, when silence fell, it wasn't judgmental. It was attentive. The words hit like a gavel slamming in a courtroom. Reporters scrambled to take notes. News stations broadcasted the statement live. The world no longer saw a scandal. They saw a woman reclaiming her narrative. John turned to Rosalind, pride shining in his eyes. Without hesitation, he reached for her hand, holding it tightly in front of the cameras. "We're not hiding anymore," he declared. And before anyone could react, he pulled her into a deep kiss, right there, in front of the entire world. The room erupted. Photographers captured every second. Within minutes, the images dominated headlines, trending worldwide. But Rosalind didn't care about the noise anymore, because she knew this was no longer a transaction. This was love. Meanwhile, across the city, police entered Vanessa Monroe's office. Before she could run, an arrest warrant was placed on her desk. She had lost. And as for Rosalind and John, they had just won everything. 6 months later, the sky blazed in shades of gold and amber as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow over the vast ocean. Waves lapped gently against the shore, whispering a melody only they could hear. Rosalind stood barefoot in the warm sand, her heart racing as John Brown knelt before her. No contracts, no obligations. Just one simple question. No contracts, no obligations, Just one simple question: will you marry me? John Brown, the man who once kept his heart locked away, now looked at her not as a transaction, but as the woman he loved beyond measure. She didn't need to think. She nodded, because she knew sometimes the most desperate choices lead to the most beautiful love stories. 1 month later, in a garden bathed in golden sunlight and blooming with flowers, Rosalind walked down the aisle with her father. Soft music filled the air, blending with the gentle rustling of the wind. Guests turned their heads, watching in admiration as she made her way toward the man waiting for her. David Smith, the father who had once clung to life by a thread, who had once been her greatest burden and her greatest love, now stood tall beside her. The illness had taken much from him, but not this moment. Today, he was no longer the man she had to protect. Today, he was the man who proudly placed his daughter's hand into John Brown's, the man who had not only fought for her, but had sworn to love and cherish her for the rest of his life. John waited at the altar, standing tall, his presence unwavering, a silent promise of forever. As she reached him, he took her hand from her father's, his touch both firm and tender. As they spoke their vows, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. This wasn't just love. This was a love they had fought for. David wiped away a tear. He had once feared his daughter would sacrifice too much for him, that she would lose herself, but today, he saw with absolute certainty that Rosalind had not only found herself, she had found true happiness. From a desperate transaction, they had found love, and this time it was priceless.